Hi, my name's Trevor Loudon. I'm a blogger, political activist and researcher from Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm here on a 4-month tour of the United States promoting my book, Barack Obama and the Enemies Within. And my claim to fame is that I'm a researcher who's investigated the background of your president extensively, particularly regarding his Marxist and communist ties. I was the first to publicly highlight Obama's connections to the Hawaiian communist Frank Marshall Davis and exposed Obama's communist green job czar Van Jones, after which he had to leave the White House. Now, a lot of people ask me a very simple question, why should I care about the internal politics of the United States? And I say there are two basic reasons. The first is simple gratitude. My country is only free, was only saved in World War II because of the huge sacrifice of your fathers and grandfathers and uncles in the battles of Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea and Midway. Without that huge sacrifice, my country would have been subjugated by the Japanese Imperial Army. The second reason is a little more selfish. Ronald Reagan had it right. This is the last best hope for mankind. If freedom fails in the United States of America, it fails in every corner of the globe. Basically, if you lose your military superiority, you lose your world leadership. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Cubans, the North Koreans, the Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans, and all of their allies will carve up this globe amongst themselves. Now, I live way down the bottom of the South Pacific. A lot of people email me and they say, look, if Obama gets back in again, can we come and live in New Zealand? And I say, look, it's a wonderful country, you'll enjoy it, but really there is nowhere to run now. Just 1,500 miles to the north of my country lie the beautiful Fijian Islands. Great tourist destination, but they now have a Marxist government. The Chinese are training the Fijian military and building big hydroelectric dams on the islands. Fiji is basically now a Chinese client state. Just a few months ago, the Australian Minister of Defence was up in China and a top Chinese official embarrassed him publicly. He said, now is the time for Australia to choose. Do you stay under American protection or do you come under Chinese protection? And that is the kind of offer, the kind of protection that Tony Soprano would offer you. And this would not have happened under Reagan or under Bush or even under Clinton, but it's happening now because the bad guys of the world are getting bolder and bolder because of the leadership they see coming out of your White House. And all around the world, your allies from Israel to Australia to New Zealand to Taiwan to Japan are very, very concerned because they see that your president seems to love the bad guys more than he loves them. And this is creating a huge amount of instability around the globe. It's a huge, people are looking to make new alliances, looking to see which bully they have to curry favour with, because they see that the United States is no longer a dependable ally. And that's a very, very serious situation as far as world liberty goes. Most Americans focus on the economy. They focus on their own country, and that's very, very understandable. But there's a big world power play in action right now. And I'd like to go back to 1984 to give an example of exactly how the enemies of the United States can work. Now, in my country, in that year, we elected a socialist Labour government. And one of the very first things they did was to enact legislation banning nuclear warships from our harbours. Now, as you guys were the only people sending warships to our harbours, that killed overnight the Australia-New Zealand-United States military alliance. ANZUS, stone cold dead, and it hasn't been revived to this day. Now, how would it happen at the height of the Cold War that a pro-American, pro-Western country like New Zealand could so willingly turn its back on the Western alliance? Well, a few years after this event, I had the pleasure of interviewing over several months a New Zealander who had infiltrated the local Communist Party for our security intelligence services, the equivalent of the American FBI. The man was a government spy inside the Communist Party. And in 1983, he was given the greatest honor any communist could enjoy. He was sent to Moscow to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in Leningradsky Prospect. Now this was a huge place, 3,500 students at any one time, many of them on 7-year courses, some of them with one-to-one tutelage. This was the training ground, the academy for the future world communist leadership. There were people there from Sri Lanka and the Philippines and Thailand and Luxembourg and Italy and Greece. Virtually every country was represented except for one, and it was the main enemy itself, the United States of America. And the only reason there were no Americans there was at some point your government had told the Soviets that were any Americans caught training at that institute, there would be war. And the Soviets respected that. But what they would do, they would train Canadians or Mexicans or New Zealanders in the doctrines they wanted promoted, and those people would go and train the American communists. But anyway, my friend sat down in a room with the other 3 members of his delegation, with members of the KGB and tutors from the Institute. And they had a plan, a very important plan, because this was a time of the massive anti-nuclear marches through Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people were marching for peace, against NATO, against the nuclear umbrella over Europe. And there was a real fear in some circles that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which America was the linchpin of and still is today, there were real fears it might break up. And the Soviets were, of course, funding these peace marches, funding the local communist parties that organized them, because they wanted NATO to break up so that they could dominate Europe. And it's important to remember that to Moscow, then and as now, your military and your military alliances have always been their #1 target, because your military is the only thing standing between them and what they want, which is basically world domination. So my friends sat down in the room. The plan was this. They had the big thing going in Europe. They were trying to break up NATO, but they thought, well, how about we break away another country from the Western Alliance, somewhere outside of Europe, and the psychological and propaganda impact of that will spur on the peace movement in Europe and lead to the destruction of NATO. So the plan was this. They picked on New Zealand because we were small, socially liberal, progressive, and the communists were very, very strong in our labour movement. They controlled our peace movement, and they had infiltrated our Labour Party, our ruling party at the time. So they knew they had to sell this as, they couldn't really sell this as an anti-American thing because most New Zealanders were very pro-American. So this had to be a patriotic New Zealand thing. This had to be Kiwis standing up for peace, Kiwis standing against the nuclear arms race, New Zealanders striking an independent foreign policy, all chest-thumping, patriotic stuff. So they worked out the slogans, they worked out the psychology, and the small delegation left Moscow, returned to New Zealand. They had secret meetings with the New Zealand Labour Party, with the peace movement, with the labour unions, and they mounted a campaign, a big campaign, and in a few short months, that legislation was in front of our Parliament, it was passed, and our alliance with America was killed stone cold dead. Just like that. And I will tell you now that if you ever talk to any New Zealander, most of them about our anti-nuclear stand of 1984, which is still in existence today, even the Conservatives don't dare to overturn it. Most New Zealanders will puff out their chests with pride, and they'll say, yeah, we did it. We stood against the nuclear arms race. We stood up for peace, and they'll be so proud. And hardly one of them in 4 million people would have any idea that those policies they're so proud of, that they trumpet so loudly, were designed in Moscow by the KGB at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. That is how a whole nation can be duped by policies enacted by a foreign power, directed in a subtle and intelligent way. A whole nation can be led down the wrong path. And that is what happened to my country, and it is exactly what is happening to your country in many facets today. So why is this relevant to the United States? Because the left has an agenda for America, and it's a very, very scary agenda. And I want to build up a little bit of background to this. Now, Mr. Obama has a background in the hard left. He's basically a red diaper baby who was brought up in the Marxist movement his entire life. The first significant mentor to Barack Obama was, of course, a man called Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis started out as a Communist Party member in Chicago in the 1940s, very, very up in the Chicago left. He was a journalist, a poet, a jazz critic, a writer, and it was a very dynamic movement at the time. But in 1948, Frank Marshall Davis left Chicago, moved out to Hawaii, which was then really a backwater in the Pacific. And the big question is, why would he do that? Well, Comrade Stalin, a few years before that, had ordered the American Communist Party to put as many comrades as they could out into Hawaii, because that is where Pearl Harbor is. And Stalin wanted as many spies as he could get on the islands and as many agitators as he could get to close the bases down. Because then and as now, your military is Moscow's #1 target. So Frank Marshall Davis was a very active communist out in Hawaii, and the FBI, who watched him for 19 years, were very concerned about him. They put together a 600-page file on the man. And one of the main reasons they were concerned, they were getting regular reports that he was out seen photographing obscure Hawaiian beaches with a camera with a telescopic lens. And I think they suspected military espionage because they put Frank Marshall Davis on Security Index A, which was reserved for only the most dangerous communists and meant that had war ever broken out with the Soviet Union, Mr. Davis could have been arrested that very day. Now, this is the man who in 1970, around that time, was chosen to be the mentor to the young kid Barack Obama, who had just returned from Indonesia. And that was done by Mr. Obama's paternal grandfather, Stanley Dunham, who chose his whiskey-drinking, dope-smoking buddy, Frank Marshall Davis, to do the job. And Mr. Obama mentions Frank Marshall Davis 22 times in his book, Dreams from My Father, as a mentor, a guide, someone he talked politics with, someone he turned to for advice. The next very significant mentor to Mr. Obama that I think is relevant to this is a woman called Alice Palmer. Now, she was an Illinois state senator, and she basically got Mr. Obama his first job. She guided him into that job as a state senator in the mid-90s. Now, Alice Palmer had a very strong background in the communist movement. She was involved with the World Peace Council, which was the Soviet Union's #1 international front. The Soviets put billions of rubles into this. It was designed, and it still exists by the way, it was designed to agitate against your military. The big job was to propagandize against your military alliances around the world, against Star Wars, against any weapons system that might give the United States superiority over its enemies. It was their #1 political front, international propaganda front, and Alice Palmer was heavily involved in it. She was also involved in the United States affiliate, the US Peace Council, as an executive member. Alice Palmer also ran a network of black communist journalists in the United States called the Black Press Institute, and she took several of these people in 1985 for a trip to the Soviet Union, East Germany, and communist Czechoslovakia. She was also in Moscow in 1986 covering that year's annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and was in the same year elected as North American Vice President of the International Organization of Journalists, a bona fide Soviet front. So Alice Palmer, the woman who got Obama his first job in politics, was effectively a Soviet agent of influence. So you got Frank Marshall Davis, communist, possible Soviet spy; Alice Palmer, Democrat, definite Soviet agent of influence. Both of them involved in anti-military activities on behalf of the Communist Party or the Soviet Union. You go forward, people around Obama today, Valerie Jarrett, his closest advisor, his most trusted friend. Her whole family was involved in some aspect of the far-left radical movement. Her paternal grandfather was Robert Taylor, first black head of the Chicago Housing Authority, was affiliated in 1940 with the American Peace Mobilization. And that was the Communist Party's main front at the time, and their job was to try and keep your troops out of World War II. They were agitating actively to keep America out of Europe. And the reason for that was simple, because at that time the Soviet Union was still allied to Nazi Germany, and Stalin had ordered the American communists to keep you guys out of Europe to allow Hitler to finish the job of invading Europe. But in 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin, invaded the Soviet Union, and overnight the American Peace Mobilization became the American People's Mobilization, the most pro-war, let's get Hitler, let's destroy the Nazis organization in the United States. And Robert Taylor was involved with that alongside a man called Frank Marshall Davis. On the other side of Valerie Jarrett's family was a man called Vernon Jarrett, her late father-in-law. Now, the last thing he did before he died of cancer in 2004, he was a very prominent Chicago journalist. He issued a call to the black population of Chicago to get out and vote for Mr. Obama in that year's Senate primaries. But if you go back to 1946, Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Illinois State Executive of American Youth for Democracy. American Youth for Democracy was the youth wing of the Communist Party USA. Go forward to 1948. Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Packing House Workers Strike Committee Publicity Committee. The Packing House Workers were a communist labour union out on strike, and Vernon Jarrett was writing their press releases and propaganda. And on that tiny publicity committee with Vernon Jarrett served a man called Frank Marshall Davis. So basically the two most powerful people in America, Barack Obama and his chief advisor Valerie Jarrett, can both trace their political lineage back to the Chicago Communist Party of the 1940s, and specifically to Frank Marshall Davis. Now, interestingly, there's another connection to Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis was a member, an active supporter of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born, Communist Party's main front. And he was active in that right up to the late 1970s. Now, on that same, another supporter of that organisation listed two names below Frank Marshall Davis on their list of endorsers was a man called Hugh DeLacy. Now, Hugh DeLacy was involved in the American Peace Mobilization in the 1940s. He was a top member of that. He was also a Democrat congressman out of Washington State. But for many, many years, from the 1940s up to the 1970s at least, he was a secret card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. Now, he ended up settling in Santa Cruz, California. And he had a very good friend in Santa Cruz, the local congressman. And that congressman was Leon Panetta, who is now your Secretary of Defense. And the Panettas and the DeLacys were very good friends. They had parties at each other's houses. When Panetta died, when Hugh DeLacy died in 1986, 4 people read eulogies to him at his memorial service. One of them was Leon Panetta, and the other 3 were all members of a Marxist organization called Democratic Socialists of America. Now, Leon Panetta and Hugh DeLacy had a whole series of correspondence going, went for about 9 or 10 years, and it was all about opposing Reagan's policies of containing communism in Latin America, opposing Star Wars, cutting back the US military. It was all peacenik, anti-military stuff. That was the whole tenor of the conversation. But Hugh DeLacy had some very interesting contacts. He was a close friend of a man called John Stuart Service. Now, basically, John Stuart Service had been a member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring of the 1940s, the people who had worked with your State Department to tilt US foreign policy in favour of the Chinese communists, basically betrayed China to the communists. In 1975, Hugh de Lacy, with the connivance of John Stuart Service, was given a free month-long trip to communist China. And while he was there, he met with two American expatriates, Frank Coe and Solomon Adler. Frank Coe was working as a propagandist for the Chinese government, also a member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring. Solomon Adler was another member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring, and at that time was a serving advisor to the Chinese intelligence services, a live Chinese spy. Back in the United States, Hugh de Lacy was also corresponding with Don Wheeler, a communist out of Washington State, a former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring in Washington, D.C. of the 1940s. He's also corresponding with Victor Perlow, a communist out of Connecticut, another former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring. So this friend, very close friend of Leon Panetta's, was basically in contact with 5 former Soviet KGB agents, one of whom was still a live Chinese spy. And this was the man who was best friends for many years with your current Secretary of Defense. Now that brings me to the real agenda of the left. The real agenda of the left in this country is basically to destroy your military. That is what this is all about. And this has been going on for some time now. This is why the Soviets have been funding the peace movement, why the Soviets funded the United States Peace Council, the United States Communist Party, because their number one objective has always been to bring your military to its knees. And now you have a situation in the United States where your Commander-in-Chief, Mr. Obama, is working with your Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, to slash your military budget to ribbons. Now, Mr. Obama has even posited, and he's got a paper commissioned to cut your US nuclear arsenal down to 292 nuclear weapons. You used to have more than 6,000. The Russians alone have more than 1,500 that we know about. Yet Mr. Obama thinks it is a wise course of action to destroy your, basically to destroy the defenses of this country. Whole chunks have been cut out of the army, whole chunks out of the navy, weapon systems cancelled, and who is cheering him on? Who is endorsing him for his re-election? None other than Vladimir Putin himself. Now, I think if you look back, in March this year, Mr. Obama did a very significant thing. He was in Korea having talks with Dmitry Medvedev, then the Russian president. He was off mic, so he thought, and he said to Mr. Medvedev, they were discussing missile defense, and he said to Mr. Medvedev, I need more space. When I get re-elected, I'll have more flexibility to deal with you. And Medvedev says, yes, I understand. I will pass your message on to Vladimir. We are with you. That is the single most significant thing your president has said in his entire term of office, because that is the agenda of the left. It's not about bringing your country down economically. That's part of it. It is not about healthcare. That's part of it too. The big agenda is wreck your economy to the point that Americans will accept the gutting of their military. That is the agenda. Nothing else comes close to that as far as the communists, as far as the Russians and all their allies are concerned, because there is no way back for you from that point. This is not about a depression, because Americans can survive a depression. This is not about losing some of your rights, because you guys are Americans and you'll stand up and take them back. But have you ever been in a position before where your Commander-in-Chief and your Secretary of Defense are basically giving your number one enemy everything it wants? And project it forward, ladies and gentlemen, 4 more years. If Obama gets 4 more years, how much military do you think you will have left? And how effective will it be? And you think about this. If in 4 more years' time your military is way run down, the Russians have increased their armaments, the Chinese have built up their blue water navy in the Pacific, Iran has nuclear weapons, and everything is going in their favour, and a future Republican comes along and says, I'm standing for president, I'm going to rebuild the United States military to its former levels, to its former power. Do you think for 1 minute the Russians and the Chinese and all their allies will sit on their hands and let you guys do it? Do you think when they've got you exactly where they want you, that they would for 1 minute entertain letting you rebuild your military might? So this is really no way back. There's really no way back from this, folks. This is either get rid of this president and restore your military, or allow this man to destroy your military capability, your ability to defend your country and defend your allies, taking you to a point where there is no return. Because if this continues, not only will you not be able to defend your allies like Israel or Japan or Taiwan or Australia, but you will not even be able to defend your homeland. And you will have no alternative but to accept some sort of United Nations world superstate, or face the combined military might of Russia and China and Iran and Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela and all their crazy allies, with not a friend in the world to come to your aid. So this is really my message to America. This election isn't just about you guys. This is about the survival of the free world, the survival of the Western world, because how America goes, we all go. If America goes down, you lose your military leadership, you lose your world dominance. The bad guys are going to take over, and there will be nowhere left to run. China will dominate the Pacific, Russia will dominate Europe, China will also dominate Africa, Iran will dominate the Middle East, and there will be no safe havens left. And if some people in the world think, a world led by America isn't so hot, well, a world led by Russia or China will be a whole different ball game, and I think the consequences of that would be quite horrific. So my message is basically, this election really, about more than anything else, is America going to go down the path of peace through security, or is it going to go down the path of war and possible destruction by gutting your military? That is the alternative, and that is America's survival at stake, and it's the survival of the whole Western world. So I urge every American to consider that when they go to the ballots this November. That is the number one question that should be uppermost in their mind when they cast their vote. I'm here as a New Zealander because I'm concerned about the United States and the direction it's going and the implications for the whole free world, including my country. If Americans would like to know more about their president and his Marxist connections, his Communist Party ties and his agenda, please consider reading my book, Barack Obama and the Enemies Within. It's available from Pacific Freedom Foundation. That's pacificfreedomfoundation.org. You can get the book online. Please consider reading it, and thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking to you.